Hello, good evening, and welcome back. So, in order to expedite travel processes, the UK has decided to try and form air bridges. That is to say, countries of which they can be trusted as to be honest with the infections and the people who are traveling on their airlines. So, if they're tested their side and they are trusted to have sufficiently rigorous tests, then they will not need to go into a 14-day quarantine when they come over here. And the first one, in particular, that they've picked is the United States. Concurrently, Donald Trump has doubled down on him freezing his gifts towards the World Health Organization, and said that, seeing as they're parroting the Chinese talking points far too much, they're clearly in the pocket of China, and if they don't stop this and allow independent reviews into the Wuhan labs, for example, as a show to say, okay, the World Health Organization is not just another talking piece of China, then he will drop out of the organization entirely, taking the 15% of the funding that the World Health Organization gets with him. So they better play ball within 30 days or they're gone. So, UK air bridges. UK tourism boss backs call for air bridges. The boss of the UK's National Tourism Agency has thrown her weight behind setting up so-called air bridges with countries with low coronavirus rates. Visit Britain Chief Executive Patricia Yates told MPs it was an interesting idea and indicated the US could be open to agreeing a deal. Now, the key thing to note here is it is about honesty, openness, and if they can be reliable in terms of knowing who is infected before they get on the aircraft. That is the key point here in order to stop those infections. Because if you're trying to say, oh, we want them with low infectious rates or low coronavirus rates, and then says, what about America? So, well, what about no? Because I hope you're not planning to fly out from New York of all the places in the world. If you're trying to say low coronavirus rates and pick New York, there's quite a discontinuity there. Bit of a contradiction. So a government spokesperson said air bridges were not an agreed policy. Well, of course not. These things need to be talked about. He said, work on this is continuing. Ultimately, we will be guided by the science and the health of the public must come first. Livelihood is included in health. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps suggested on Monday that the government's plan to quarantine people arriving in the UK for 2 weeks could include exceptions. He said, we should indeed consider further improvements, for example, things like air bridges enabling people from other countries who have themselves achieved lower levels of coronavirus infection to come to the country. And the difficulty here is if they're trying to be nice to America, then they've got to change their tact, at least slightly. She added that other valuable markets for mutual arrangements also include France, Germany and Italy. So, funnily enough, of course, this would be the more affluent countries, except for China. So I'm sure this will please the ethno-nationalists more to try and suggest that, well, it's going to be the white countries in particular, predominantly America, of course, that is going to be getting the better treatment. Because if they're a poorer country, chances are it's because of a worse climate which has inhibited their development, in which case it's going to reflect in the complexion of the skin, because it's a hotter climate, it's more difficult to do things, and hence the melanin, that the skin is darker. And if you're looking for white people, then you will find them in the more temperate climates. That's just how humans function best. So in that case, they're the most well-developed countries, and they're the ones that are going to getting the special privileges of air bridges. And that's how you can talk about white countries being more successful without saying it's down to race. Good. So, as airlines have objected to the government's 14-day quarantine, because they say it'll put people off from travelling, maybe, but if we're all used to it by now, maybe it won't. It would do if it was just tourism, but I don't think enough people have disposable income now to actually worry about that. Mr. Shapps said the quarantine measure, which is set to come in early next month, would initially be a blanket situation. The government was in active discussions about other options. And it wouldn't take long, seeing as they want their 100 million vaccines coming out, and the antibody testing coming out as well, to then say, well, yeah, if it will be a blanket ban at the beginning of the month, but although you might lift them to have the air bridges, it won't take long to then say, well, we don't need to worry about this. There doesn't need to be a new normal. It's up to you if you wish to do what like the TSA did after 9/11 in order to create that the new normal, as we now accept. Same thing with the Patriot Act, in order to basically be more like Big Brother and just spy on what people are doing in order for that to become the new normal, because apparently it's safety, if people wish to accept the same thing. So seeing as people have already given up their privacy, will they also be willing to give up freedom of movement in order to keep the safety? And at what point does it then become that life isn't worth living because there are events that are worse than death? So Airlines UK says, if the government does not insist on doing this with minimal exemptions in place, we need strict rolling reviews to be enforced so that this policy is not in place a second longer than it needs to be. Yep, exactly that. They're looking out for themselves, and they'd be in a terrible situation if their clientele died. So they don't want people to die. They don't want a second wave if they then have to be closed down. It's not just... So yes, it's selfish, but it's understanding consequences, knowing that the most selfish thing is what is best for everyone else. Otherwise, you cannot have a successful company in a capitalist economy. So, back to Donald Trump, who's giving his 30-day ultimatum over the COVID-19 handling from coronavirus. He's done his 4-page letter. And the letter outlines a 30-day deadline for the body to commit to substantive improvements or risk losing millions in US membership altogether. So, the letter itself mentions that the World Health Organization delayed an emergency declaration under pressure from Xi Jinping, noting that they've had various whistleblowers who did come out earlier in order to say there is a problem, and they were then silenced, and there was, I forget the word now used, but for the lab that the guy was working in, that was then taken from him, and of course he was detained and arrested, and there were about half a dozen different scientists that met the same fate as him. And the World Health Organization, instead of saying this is terrible, we must do something about this, seeing as it could infect the world, and that anyone who is part of the World Health Organization has to mention this emergency within 24 hours of being aware of it, China didn't, and the WHO didn't care at all, basically. And of course they heard from Taiwan that there is human-to-human infection, and China said no, so they went with China instead of going with what the evidence said at the time, just hoping that it would all blow over, because of course China had their particular important meeting at the time, and they didn't want that to be taken over by a concern about a pandemic, and hence actually made it worse. But that was their intention at the time, which is why they didn't want to mention it. He also criticizes the agency's praise of China's transparency amid its censorship and lack of international cooperation. Of course, one thing similar to this is that they would send out memos to their companies abroad to say, hey, buy up all the PPE that you can, because we're going to be needing it soon, and we want you to get it before we tell everyone else. So it's insider trading of sorts, so that we can protect ourselves. Accuses the World Health Organization of failing to comment on virus-related discrimination against Africans within China. Of course, they do also mention against Taiwan that they shouldn't be permitting such discrimination there. Obviously, the UN do agree that Taiwan is part of China and not its own separate country. And Trump also said that Dr. Tedros could have saved many lives if he had acted more like Dr. Harlan Brundtland, the World Health Organization chief, during the SARS outbreak of 2003. She, of course, said, let's not fly to southern China, to Southeast Asia, the countries that are worst affected. Let's shut down those flights so it can't interact and infect more people. Similarly to how Tedros said that China was doing a great job with stopping their domestic flights so that people can't get infected, and yet concurrently saying, but everyone else, yeah, you should be able to fly to China. So obviously we're saying they're doing a good job by not infecting their own people, but hey, why stop flights to China? Even if that is the worst affected place, you might as well keep doing it. And in the letter, the brilliant bit is where Trump points out that, yes, you said that we shouldn't be closing the borders, and yet I did, and that was the right thing to do. And he says, you also strongly praised China's strict domestic travel restrictions, but were inexplicably against my closing of the United States border or the ban with respect to people coming from China. I put the ban in place regardless of your wishes. It's a time like these when we all wish we could do a Trump impression. So in his conclusion, he says that repeated missteps by Dr. Tedros and the World Health Organization had been extremely costly for the world, and the only way forward for the WHO is if it can actually demonstrate independence from China. And it's got to show within 30 days the major substantive improvements without particularly saying what in particular. But of course, this is a memo of which they wish to then go into more detail on an individual basis. The point of this is to, as it is an open letter, is to tell other people we're taking this seriously and we want to do something about it. Now let's sort it out with them exactly what can be done. And we've got 30 days in order to sort that out. So they ask why the World Health Organization is facing criticism, and I think I've covered that, and at this point we all know. President Xi Jinping said on Monday that any vaccine developed in China would be made a global public good. Seeing as their PPE has been ineffective and some of it has already been infected, I wouldn't really trust that at all. And they would want to keep the good stuff in order to protect their own people, and they might not want to give it out to anyone else either, because there's a particular thing about China which is extremely, extremely patriotic, but so much so that it is deference to the government instead of to the country, where they're still praising Mao, Chairman Mao, and it's all done in accordance with the party line, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and all the 7 parties that they can choose from to vote for are still all owned by the Xi Jinping. Not that they can vote anymore anyway, because Xi Jinping is now president for life, a presidentator, if you will, if you like China Uncensored. And that is why they have such incredible censorship and scrub the internet of things like Tiananmen Square, and they have their great firewall of China, and they use WeChat so they can see what everyone is doing, and even if you have a VPN, that's an offense, and even if you do something abroad, they can still find you and arrest you when you go back to China. Those kind of things to ensure that there can be no dissidents. And although, the World Health Organization is saying, oh, China has done a great job in controlling it, so this has been incredibly authoritarian. It's like, yeah, but it stops the virus. It's like, well, this is why we need different groups of different types of people to then understand the ramifications of other people's advice, because they don't have a full picture, but somebody else could understand then what the impact could be in their area of expertise. So good for World Health Organization, but we do need a few other committees in order to know what's going on. We do need some other experts in their respective fields, if you will. Let's not just listen to one. Yes, it's a medical emergency, but any action has consequences, and very likely to be unexpected consequences from anyone. And it would be nice if governments can start to think, maybe there are unintended consequences, and we should actually be considering them. But getting back to China, that they've just taken control of their populace, and so if you speak to anyone from mainland China, they'll think that the Chinese government is great, and that they've been told that anyone from outside of China is mainly a lesser person and would be trying to lie, and they wish to speak badly of China because they're jealous and will therefore spread a load of disinformation or misinformation and lies about the CCP, Xi Jinping, and Chinese history, so that outsiders cannot be trusted. Therefore, if you do meet someone from mainland China and try to raise things like Tiananmen Square, then they'll most likely not believe you and then say it's a hoax and things like that, and that there are other explanations, and maybe Deng Xiaoping did the right thing in going down on the dissidents and then trying to explain that they're not, and then at that point it just becomes, oh, well, that's just Western propaganda to tear down China. That it's so ingrained from such an early age that's why I say it's patriotism to a very, very strong extent, whereby it's not for the country, it's for the government, it's for the Communist Party. So, with that in mind, as they have been funding Ethiopia in order to get Dr. Tedros, as doctor as in PhD, not medical, into his position, that they've also got, their money in his pockets, and therefore are pushing him to do what they want to do. Hence the concerns that the World Health Organization is just a Chinese health organization. But to wrap up, the FT, the Financial Times newspaper, reports that the US is planning to publicly distance itself from some of the wording in the resolution, and is expected to pass despite any US objections. So this is there, as I say, just to put out the front memo as a kind of working draft, if you will, of sorts, which is supposed to be hard-hitting but also vague. So we can say that it's definitely wrong. Here are the examples of what you did wrong, and we need stuff sorted in this time frame. But exactly what we need doing, that is down to negotiations and discussions, so that if we don't do everything that we wish to set out to do privately, we then won't be told that we haven't succeeded because we were never expecting to get everything that we wanted, and we don't just want to give the media more ammunition for then us not doing everything that we wanted to do, even though we understood that we wouldn't be able to do it. So, with that in mind, I'm intrigued to know how the air bridges are going to pan out, and if they're going to be more concerned about testing instead of just if it's from a low infection place, and if they're even necessary, given that we have the virus spreading around us anyway, in which case do we need them to quarantine when they come in, because you're supposed to quarantine the sick, sure, but they should have done that from the very beginning and not just thinking about it now. It's a bit late, we're already lifting restrictions, why are they only just bringing in quarantines for people from other countries? And it's so good to see that Trump is taking the stance with the World Health Organization. Of course, he's been against China for decades, or at least the CCP for decades, and doesn't appreciate their practices. And people appreciate him for that, of course. And hopefully, combining with his attack on the WHO, that then he'll be a key player in being able to talk to China and say, well, yes, the World Health Organization was wrong to do this, but you were wrong to tell them what to do. Therefore, we don't want anything to do with the WHO. We don't want anything to do with you. But as this was your problem, either you made something to purposely infect the rest of us as attempted murder, or you made something and then let it out, in which case it's manslaughter, or you didn't know that you made something, but you still let it out and then you didn't help us after you knew that it had been released, in which case it's still manslaughter. So yes, you do need to pay for the damage that you've caused. But then that could quickly escalate to a Cold War. But no doubt something has to be done, because they're always pushing it further with their military displays, of course, in the South China Sea and their 7-dash line, and that's why they're building their artificial islands in the South China Sea, which then just become military bases. And when they use debt trap diplomacy to lend money to a country in order to build something there, and knowing that the country can't pay it back, and then they take control of whatever it is, like ports in Europe, like Trieste in Italy, that's what they like to do. But hey, we'll see how this all pans out. It's safe to say that Trump is trying to act in order to get something done. So hopefully this is the start of something good. So until next time, as always, have a good one.